Call to order the meeting of the Michigan Board of State Canvassers. First item on our agenda is public comment. Mr. Perkasi, has someone asked to speak?
We do have an individual on Zoom that has requested to speak, and I don't know if you have any other cards as well, in addition to whatever you might have.
Are we connected to?
Yeah, Mr. Gallant has requested to speak.
Mr. Gallant, you have 1 minute.
1 minute, Lily. Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Please request. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Can I get my minute now? Madam Chair, this is James Gallant, Marquette County Suicide Prevention Coalition. Please request an Attorney General opinion concerning Robert's Rules of Order being required under the Constitution at public meetings. What we saw, remember when I accused Secretary Brader of unlawful practice of law? You're getting legal advice from the secretary in real time. And then you are giving that legal advice to these canvassers to say they don't have to follow Robert's Rules of Order. I don't think you ever voted on that. And you're just kind of making that up. So that's kind of unauthorized practice of law. So this is where this kind of going. And they just did this in Marquette County. And into 2024 presidential primary election, the Marquette County clerk advised, the legal advice to the clerk, to the chair, was that she could certify the election with only 2 Democrats and 1 Republican on that board. That's the majority of one political party, and it is direct contradiction of the Constitution. This is where this legal advice is coming in. This is ushering in the Marxist-style communism that contradicts the law. You just take the legal advice from Jonathan Brader, and then you just pass it on. And now it's good. Good luck to you to have Member Dawn and the other members to say that they agreed to you outside the meeting not to follow Robert's rules. Now, please get that legal advice, that Attorney General opinion, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Gallant. Eric Doster has also requested to speak. Good morning, Mr. Doster.
Good morning, Eric Doster on behalf of no one.
Sorry, on behalf of whom?
No one.
Not even yourself?
Well, myself. Okay, we'll limit it to 1. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I just looking for some assistance on the topic of non-citizen voting. And as you vote, one of the agenda items later today is certification of the results of the election. And I just asking the question, directing it to the board, maybe it's better directed to the Bureau of Elections, what measures are there in place to detect or prevent a non-citizen from registering or voting in Michigan? That's my essential question. I mean, I've got some sub-questions under that, but, like how does the Secretary of State's office, detect or prevent not a citizen voting? What tools are available to a local clerk? Is there maybe this is the same question. Is there any kind of measuring stick, a database, a process that we can like overlay the QVF with non-citizen vote, and detect the non-citizen voting? I mean, we're aware of the situation in Ann Arbor, but that was a person who, reported themselves. But in absent of self-reporting system, how does that get detected or prevented? So that's my question.
Director Brader, do you want to address that issue?
Sure. I mean, there's a number of procedures in place that we use. First of all, I mean, the majority of people who register and vote in Michigan register through automatic voter registration at our Secretary of State branches. And when you're getting a driver's license, you need to provide a document that shows that you're legally present in Michigan. It doesn't have to be a citizenship document because non-citizens can get driver's licenses. However, you do have to provide a document. So the majority of people are registering through automatic voter registration. And if anybody provides a non-citizen document, that automatically shuts off the automatic voter registration. So there is not a requirement in Michigan law that you provide a document that proves you're a U.S. citizen to register to vote. That's not a law on our books, so it's not a requirement that we enforce, nor could we. But as a practical matter, most people who are registering to vote are providing a document for their driver's license, which is what leads to voter registration. There are other methods that voters have the right to use under state and federal law when it comes to registering to vote, and that is a paper voter registration form. That paper voter registration form requires somebody to attest multiple times that they're a U.S. citizen. You have to check a box that says, I am a U.S. citizen. You have to sign a statement under penalty of perjury that says, I am a U.S. citizen. Additionally, when you apply to vote, whether it be absentee voting or in-person voting, you also have to attest your eligibility to vote, including U.S. citizenship. So you're signing multiple statements under penalty of perjury, indicating that you are eligible to vote, including the fact that you're a U.S. citizen. There is not a list of all non-U.S. citizens in the United States. That does not exist. There is a program called the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements, or SAVE program, that can be used to review the current status of non-citizens when we already know someone's a non-citizen. So if we have information like an alien number, an A number, that you can look that up in the SAVE program, and it will give you basically a status update on that person as to their status. But there isn't something that we can cross-check the entire qualified voter file to, which is like a list of non-citizens. That does not exist. We use the measures that we have in place under law to verify it. If there are instances where, if an individual casts an illegal vote, whether it be somebody who's not eligible to vote or somebody who is able to vote in multiple states, we do rely on the criminal justice system as a method of enforcement and deterrence in those instances. So part of the safeguards that we have in place include both the punishment and the deterrence of enforcing our criminal laws when people vote illegally. So that's the set of laws we have in place. We follow the law, and that's what the law provides.
I'm not suggesting you're not following the law. Please don't take it that way. Okay, so the SAVE program, that was the one thing. There was like a database. Is there a way that you can like match that up with the QVF and see if there's something that bounces, or there's in other words, if I vote if I vote, whether I'm a citizen or a non-citizen, if I vote, Eric Doster's name is going to go in the QVF as having voted in the election. So, and if is it possible to run my name from this, you mentioned a SAVE program. Would that be something that would be possible to, smack those two together and see if there's any hits? I'm just looking for ways to detect, because again, people aren't going to self-report, okay? That's not going to happen very often. So, but how do you detect it?
Well, again, I mean, unless you're a non-U.S. citizen, I don't know your citizenship status, we would not be able to run your name in SAVE, because again, it's not a database. It's not a list of names. It's a program that you use if you already know someone is a non-citizen. If you have a number, a non-citizen number,
I
a
see.
key number, you can enter that into SAVE, and SAVE will give you a snapshot of what is the current status of this person. But it is not a list of names that we can cross-check the qualified voter file with. Now, while that list does not exist of non-citizens, it is a fact that everybody who votes in any election is a public record. So the list of every single person who votes in every single election is saved and retained. And so if anybody wants to look at that list, and people have before, there have been studies, attempts to identify non-citizen voting, you may have reason to know that people are non-U.S. citizens. And so anybody could look at the list of anybody who voted in any precinct in the state and identify people that they know are non-citizens. And there have been efforts to do this, and they have found a very, very low number of non-citizens voting.
So I guess the answer to my question is you don't have any tools really to check, to detect.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is there is not a list.
Well,
All
SAVE
you-
doesn't do it. You just said SAVE doesn't do it. I'm just trying to figure out is there anything out there that would allow you to detect, other than the anecdotal, I know my neighbor voted and she's from Hungary kind of thing?
Well, I wouldn't describe the efforts that have been made as anecdotal. I mean, we've had a lot of very resourced and well-funded efforts to look at all the people who voted and try to identify non-citizens who voted, and the numbers they've come up with are extremely low. As far as whether there is a one list of all non-US citizens in the United States that we can compare the voter file with, no, that does not exist.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate the time.
You're welcome. Fred Nienstedt. Good morning. Will you spell your name for the reporter?
Erick. Yeah. So I would like to kind of follow up on that, on non-citizen voting opportunities. The historical record that you described, is that because we're looking back many years when you say it's atypical? Or is it more like we've only seen it occur lately?
Yes, please.
Can he answer?
Yeah, the question, you're directing the
I'm kind of
question.
redirecting here. I'm just wondering, is this looking back over many years? Because there's been great changes in the registration processes for individuals who wish to vote.
So I'm happy to respond to that. So the studies that I'm aware of do go back quite a few years. I don't know the exact date of them, but
But
there's
they're not
studies-
recent, right? They're not contemporary.
Well, I don't know when the reviews have stopped, but I
Thank
mean, in
you,
terms
thank
of the laws changing, I mean, that's not really accurate.
Well,
You've been
there's a lot more
You've been
registration.
You've been able to register to vote with a paper form in Michigan and other states by swearing they're a US citizen for decades. So
Yes,
it's
so
not a
motor
law.
voter is an automated process, and it's supposed to make sure that non-citizens are not registered. Is that correct? Is it a proactive item that the citizen or non-citizen who registers for a driver's license has to take? Is there a checkbox?
Would you like me to answer that question again?
Yeah, yes.
Right, okay, I've already described the automatic voter registration process. So the automatic, what motor voter requires, which is a law that dates back to 1993, is that when when eligible individuals apply for a driver's license, they have the opportunity to register to vote without having to complete a separate additional form. It's basically built into the driver's license application. It does require the person to indicate that they meet the eligibility requirements for voter registration in whatever state they're in. And in every state to vote in state and federal elections, that includes US citizenship. When it comes to Michigan's current implementation of motor voter, we do it through automatic voter registration, and that's essentially the same thing, except voter registration is an opt-out instead of an opt-in. So if you do not want to be registered, you have to check a box or affirmatively indicate that I do not want to be registered to vote.
Without
It is
checking
not,
citizenship?
it is not part of the voter registration requirement, as I already indicated, that you provide a document that says that you're a US citizen to register to vote. However, in Michigan, for purposes of getting a driver's license, you have to provide a document that shows that you're lawfully present in the United States, whether that's a non-citizen document or a citizen document. The way that automatic voter registration is set up in Michigan, if you provide a document that says you're not a US citizen, the automatic voter registration functionality shuts off and you cannot be registered through automatic voter registration.
Similar to California?
I don't know the details
Okay.
of California
So,
program.
all right, so my thought here this morning is that you might get a driver's license every 8 years, a renewal, right? So you have a contact with the Secretary of State. You may never vote. You get on the voter registration list, right? You're a qualified voter because you're automatically checked as a citizen, right? And then you go 6 years, you never vote. Now you have to be removed from the citizen rolls, from the QVF, right? Is that an automatic process? No, it has to happen because someone wants it. There has to be an actual procedure instituted or begun so that the person who never voted in 6 years is then removed. But they may get another driver's license in 8 years, and now they're back on the voter roll automatically. Is that a fair assessment of the current procedure?
No, that's not accurate. You're not removed from the voter rolls for not voting. you become inactive for not voting, we have to have affirmative evidence that you've changed your residence outside of Michigan. And then you have to be given a waiting period to have your registration canceled. However, as I've already explained, if you apply for a driver's license, you have to provide lawful presence documentation. And if that documentation is non-citizen documentation, you cannot automatically register to vote. The system does not allow for it.
So it appears to me that Michigan's voter rolls are bloated beyond belief. I'd like to know if there is a concern with the Bureau of Elections.
Want to answer that question?
Yeah, I'd refer you to
Briefly.
the federal courts, which have considered those claims and dismissed them.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda. Oh, I'm sorry.
On this issue, it sounds like what Director Brader has laid out in terms of the flags when you go through the process, the vast majority of people use to register to vote. There are certain flags, alerts that exist. In looking at the Chinese national student who voted in Ann Arbor, I thought that it was an issue if he registered to vote that day. So I checked, and the Detroit News story, Craig, I'm looking at you because your name's on it, indicated that that is in fact what had happened. So I think that's probably the question that would need addressing, not necessarily in this setting, but I think at some point establishing proper flags in that process. Because my thoughts on certain claims in years past from individuals were in many ways nonsense and poisonous to the system. But I think what Mr. Doster in particular is bringing up is something that should be thought about, addressed by, whether it's the Secretary of State's office or the legislature or in concert on ways to detect that type of stuff. Because in this case, they did self-report. It was just one individual that self-reported. I think Eric's right that people aren't generally going to self-report. I don't think there was anything that would have swayed this election one way or the other. Thank God somebody didn't win by one vote this year, because who knows how that would have gone down with that hanging out there. But I think it's, without impugning the integrity of Director Brader or the folks on his staff, I think that is something that definitely should be addressed moving forward, because those are the types of things that create a climate for quote unquote conspiracy theories. And if we don't have an answer for that and a solution for that, I think it just festers. And so I think it's important that we recognize that. I'm not saying people here aren't recognizing that, but I think that is an important piece to consider moving forward.
Thank you. It is important to note that the story that we all looked at with regard to the Chinese student who registered to vote on election day, he was not registering through the system that Director Brader has described when people get registration in connection or not in connection with the driver's license application. He registered and swore under penalty of perjury that he was a citizen. He subsequently, strangely, asked for his vote back, but he is being prosecuted for perjury. So if we want to know, and I believe for falsely voting in the election, I'm not sure what the statutory charge is, but obviously the fact that this was publicized that a non-citizen voted, but that the non-citizen is being prosecuted for it, is certainly something that I expect would deter other non-citizens from attempting to register. I hope.
I tend to agree in most instances, but, and that was my point, was the safeguards in place aren't set up to catch an instance like this. And it wasn't determinative of the outcome or anything like that, but it is a story that I think people across all political spectrums, have asked me about since it came out, is like, well, how can this happen? How can his vote count? It's like, well, once his ballot's in the box, you can't figure out who it is. And the statement was, well, why don't we do something about that? And I think that's what Eric was getting at. And like I said, I'm not intending to derail this. I want to make sure that we separate legitimate concerns from nonsense. And I think in many ways, this is a legitimate concern that should be addressed at some point moving forward.
Right. I believe that, and Director Brader can confirm this, that the ability to register on Election Day, as was done here, is in the Michigan Constitution.
That's correct.
So it is a method of registration and time of registration, which the citizens of Michigan chose by ballot initiative to put into the Constitution. That is just worth noting, that that registration is covered by federal statute, state statute, and the Michigan Constitution.
A total curiosity, does anybody have a number as to how many people actually registered the day of?
We do have that number. I don't know offhand what it is. I think it was in maybe around 20,000. I mean, this is not an exact number, but somewhere around 20,000 perhaps. Yeah, statewide.
And just as a clarification, on the same day registration, they have to do that at their clerk's office, correct?
Yes.
Anything else on this issue? Okay, the next item on our agenda is consideration of the meeting minutes for the October 18th, 2024 meeting. Do we have a motion?
I move that we accept the meeting results from our October 18, 2024 meeting.
I'll support them even though I was not present at that meeting.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The motion carries. The next item on our agenda is the canvass and certification of the November 5th, 2024 general election. Director Brader?
Thank you, Chair Gerwitz. So I have the privilege of presenting to you the official results of the November 2024 election in Michigan as certified by 83 boards of county canvassers. These official numbers represent the voices of more than 5.7 million Michigan voters, and they also represent the tireless and dedicated efforts of thousands of clerks, election staff, canvassers, and election inspectors across our state. Certification will make official another successfully administered election in Michigan, which marks yet again a substantial accomplishment for our local election officials. This cycle, officials faced the challenge of implementing numerous major changes to our election system, made by amendments to our state constitution passed by voters in 2022, as well as laws enacted by our legislature the last 2 years. Election officials got started early last year to prepare for statewide elections in 2024, while also administering local elections in 2023 and their other responsibilities. We had many new initiatives that in a typical year would be significant projects on their own. For example, election officials installed secure absent voter ballot drop boxes in every jurisdiction in the state and implemented prepaid return postage for all absent voter ballot and application envelopes. They also implemented a new permanent absent voter ballot list, which allows voters to sign up one time and be mailed ballots for all future elections unless their registration is canceled or inactivated. The new mail ballot list was especially challenging to administer during the presidential primary because permanent mail ballot voters needed a separate form to select a ballot for the party primary in which they wanted to vote, and that primary was held earlier than in past years because of another legislative change. No undertaking this year was more significant than the implementation of early in-person voting. To implement a brand new method of voting in Michigan, local election officials had to work with their counterparts in local government and their neighboring jurisdictions to form agreements at the municipal and county level to set up early voting agreements and sites. Election officials had to develop and purchase new technology and equipment and determine the procedures that would be used to administer early voting. The state did have the benefit of funding provided by the legislature to purchase equipment, rent space, and hire election workers. But even this grant process also represented a major undertaking for all involved, as we had to follow the state and local purchasing requirements and identify how we were going to pay for all this and get it distributed. There were some who predicted that early voting would not work or that voters would not embrace it, but they were wrong. Over 9 days of early voting statewide and more days in some jurisdictions, 1.2 million Michiganders cast ballots before Election Day. It was popular throughout the state and over every day of early voting. To see so many voters embrace this new option and to see election officials administer it so effectively while offering it for the first time in a major election was both inspiring and a testament to the commitment and excellence of our election workers. Another major change this year was early tabulation of absentee ballots, which election officials pushed for as a legislative change and which was enacted and used in the vast majority of the larger jurisdictions in our state. Clerks predicted that this would improve the absent voter ballot counting process, and they were proven right. With an available week to process absentee ballots before Election Day, things went much more smoothly. Results were available earlier, and it was much easier to keep track of paperwork and to keep the absent voter ballot counting board precincts in balance. We had over 2.2 million voters cast ballots absentee, and if you add that to the 1.2 million early voters we had more than 3.4 million voters casting their ballots before Election Day. So this was slightly up from the 3.3 million we had voting absentee in 2020. I think we can probably expect the majority of ballots to continue to come in before Election Day in future elections, and it'll be interesting to see how many voters continue to gravitate to early voting and absentee voting and which one they choose to utilize. We also had 2.3 million voters cast their ballots on Election Day itself, and that's where we saw the fewest changes to processes, but there were also some important innovations there as well. For example, voters now have the option to bring in their absentee ballot and to the polling place and tabulate it there, and many chose to do that. The Election Day registration process also went more smoothly this year, especially in communities with large numbers of college students who always see higher numbers of same-day registrants. Because of the new option for jurisdictions with a lot of same-day registrants to utilize Election Day vote centers where voters can put their ballots in the tabulator, we did not see the long lines that we saw in 2022, which was another major win for election officials and for voters. All told, we had more than 5.7 million Michiganders cast ballots, and that broke the previous record of around 5.6 million 4 years ago. Breaking that record is particularly notable because nationwide turnout dropped compared to 2024, while in Michigan it went up. Voters clearly took advantage of their new options in exercising their right to vote, and election officials worked with diligence and integrity to make sure they had those options. As far as the results, it's no surprise that Michigan continues to be a purple state. This year, we saw both Democrats and Republicans win national and statewide races. At the presidential and the Senate level, the margins were somewhat closer than what we saw in those races in 2020. Republican Donald Trump won the presidential election by about 80,000 votes, and Democrat Alyssa Slotkin won the Senate race by about 19,000 votes. We did have some pretty close races at the local level, in addition to one very close state representative race. And so we've already had some recount requests at the county level, and we'll see if additional candidates choose to request recounts. Election officials did an excellent job of administering this election, but no statewide election is run perfectly, and this year was no exception. As in past years, we did have some mistakes and errors in the reporting of the unofficial results on election night. It's important to understand that when there are errors in the reporting of unofficial results, it doesn't mean that the ballots were counted inaccurately. The voting equipment did count these votes accurately, and the numbers on the results tapes that come out of those tabulators and that are reviewed during the canvass were correct. Instead, these errors sometimes happen when officials are sharing the electronic versions of the unofficial results. And that's done to provide a quick snapshot of the unofficial results to the public, to the candidates, and to the media as quickly as possible. While doing that, we have Election Day precincts, absentee ballot precincts, and early voting precincts that are being reported from thousands and thousands of precincts in 1,521 municipal jurisdictions and 83 counties. And this is being done very late at night or in the wee hours of the morning after a very long day, which itself followed long weeks and long months of continuous intense work. And so occasionally under these circumstances, we do see a few human errors in how these unofficial results get reported. Those errors are caught and corrected either before or during the canvass, and that's why we have a county canvass before the results are made official. And that's what happened this year. One of the issues that got a little more attention involved absentee ballots in Battle Creek in Calhoun County. That got more attention, I think, because there's a very close state rep race there. But ultimately, the canvas worked to correct that issue, and it was identified and fixed. We also do have corrections that are made, other corrections that are made during both the county and the state canvas process. Canvassing boards also have the authority and the responsibility to retabulate ballots if there are tabulation errors on election day. That occurred this year in Macomb County, where some absent voter ballots were retabulated in Warren and Roseville. In those cases, some voter selections in certain races were not initially recorded because it appeared they had overvoted by selecting too many candidates in a race. But upon review, some of those voters actually only voted for one candidate, and they had made an accidental marking in another bubble. So their ballots were retabulated so their votes could be counted for those races and not recorded as an overvote, which would not be counted. At the state level canvas, we also identified and corrected some errors in the compiling and the submission of the results that were reported from Allegan, Calhoun, and Mackinac counties, and those corrections have been inputted prior to state certification. Ultimately, whether everything goes perfectly or whether there are initial mistakes that need to be corrected, these are all examples of our system working. Our election system is heavily decentralized. It relies on election officials and staff at 3 levels of government who all have important responsibilities, and on tens of thousands of election workers during early voting and on election day who are ordinary members of their local communities. While this decentralization can sometimes make things seem hard to keep track of, it's also a source of strength in our system through the checks and balances we have in place. And ultimately, the system worked in 2024, just as it did in 2022, in 2020, and in other recent elections. Most voters only see the election process through their typically smooth and easy experience voting and by watching the election results come in on Tuesday night. But getting to that point, especially this election cycle, took countless long hours from election officials and workers all across our state. Election workers are committed to making sure voters can fully enjoy their rights to register and cast ballots how they choose before or on election day. And this cycle especially, that meant a relentless effort and commitment to implementing these new laws over the last 2 years. Especially in the months leading up to each election day, it meant continuous high-volume, intense periods to set up elections, to register voters, to issue and receive absentee ballots, and to administer early and election day voting. So this was a grueling process, and it was extremely difficult, especially with election officials frequently being subject to unfair criticism, abuse, and in some cases even threats. But that's what it takes, and election workers got it done again. So I would like to convey my heartfelt appreciation to the clerks, the election workers across the state, and to my exceptional staff at the Bureau of Elections. Without all of these teams working together, this election could not have been administered as successfully as it was. So the state of Michigan owes all of you a tremendous debt of gratitude, and I am honored to be able to present these election results, the product of all of your many labors, for certification today. And with that, I'm happy to answer any additional questions the board has.
Questions? Member Housekin?
I have no questions.
Member Bradshaw?
I always have questions. I'd like to follow with Director Brader's comments about the election workers, clerks, the everyday citizens that actually worked this election. But I do have some questions, as I always usually have. One of them is if you can go over the process of individuals who sign an affidavit on election day, and do we have any data of how many citizens used that method of voting?
So are you referring to the affidavit of voter not in possession of photo ID?
Correct.
Okay. We do have that data does get reported. So the state ID law in Michigan is that if you have a voter ID, if you have a photo ID, you have to show it when you vote. That's a requirement. There is a process for people who do not have an ID where they can sign an affidavit of a voter not in possession of ID, and they then submit that affidavit, and then they're able to vote. And it's required that that be reported as part of the poll book results from the clerks. And so we do have that report. I don't think that I have the data for you in real time. I think it's typically in a November election, like between maybe, it's usually like in the low tens of thousands. So I'd expect that was probably the case this year too. But we can get you that number. We don't have I don't think we have every single poll book's results yet. We have the vast, vast majority of them in. But we can provide that number.
I know I've been asked that question before. That's why I'm asking it today. And then the second question I have is, can you kind of go over an explanation of the overvote and how that happens and how that's rectified? I know you've said it in your report, but if you can go over that again, please.
Sure. So I mean, if you're a voter and you're filling out your own ballot in the precincts, and like you vote, you vote in the Senate race and you vote for both Rogers and Slotkin. You can only vote for one of them. There's only one senator to be elected in this election. So if you put your ballot in the tabulator, it will give you a warning that says you've overvoted this race. Your vote in this race is not going to be counted, and then you have the option of getting a new ballot and fixing the issue when you're voting in person. And sometimes when the machine thinks that you've overvoted, it's not because you actually bubbled into bubbles, but it's that you bubbled in one and you actually, left your pen resting on one of the other bubbles. Or possibly you did bubble in two, but you crossed one out and you really voted only for one of the candidates. So when you're in person at the precinct, you get a chance to fix that before it counts your vote. With absentee ballots, obviously the voter's not there putting their own ballot in the tabulator. So there's a process when the election workers at the counting board who are counting the absentee ballots to sort of segregate those ballots from the others so they don't get tabulated yet, so that human beings can look at them. And so you have a bipartisan team of election workers, one Democrat, one Republican, who are looking at these and determining, did this voter actually vote for two, or did they make a mistake, and leave their pen somewhere, or did they cross one out so they're really only voting for one? And if they determine that they actually only voted for one, then they'll duplicate that onto a separate ballot with a corrected vote and then run that through. And that ensures, and then in some cases, like the person did just bubble into, and so they don't get their vote counted because you can't vote for two. So they go through all those one by one, and that's how it's identified at the counting board. But there were a couple places where they went through, when they put them through the machine didn't segregate them out for review. And so that was what had to be corrected during the canvass. So they then pulled them out and retabulated the ones that needed to be corrected.
Can I follow up on that? Because the couple of places that you're referring to, I believe, are Warren and Roseville, right? And then the Macomb County canvassers had to retabulate the absent voter ballots, segregating the ones which needed to be examined for possible duplication. So as I understand it, that happened because of a setting on the tabulator?
Right. Yeah. So eventually, the way it typically works is the first time you run through the ballots, the tabulator will, and the equipment they were using, it works differently for different equipment. But the equipment they were using, the first time you run it through, it's, you're supposed to set it up so that if there's an overvoted race, it's pulled out into a different tray, and then those all get looked at. And then after you look at them and duplicate them, then you change the settings of the machine so that it'll accept all the votes, whether they're overvotes or not. And if it's an overvote, it doesn't get counted. And if it's not, it does get counted. So I think the issue, as I understand it, was that the first time the ballots were run through, it was using the setting that was supposed to be used the second time they're run through after they've been checked. And so there wasn't that check in the process. And that's why they had to retabulate it during the canvass.
Yeah, so the question that I know has been raised is, how is that error revealed or documented either by the system or by people who are making observations of the count?
Yeah, so this type of issue could only happen in a counting board that was using the high-speed equipment, because otherwise you get that one at a time warning that voters get on election day. So the number of places this could potentially happen is pretty limited. But also, it's part of the typical process that's used in those locations to have ballots that are getting pulled out for review. And you have teams that are assigned to that. So some of your election workers in the county board are assigned to that job, basically, of, okay, your job today is you are going to be working with, your counterpart of the different party. You're going to be reviewing these ballots, and you're going to determine what should be done with them. So when that's not happening, that stands out as an obvious thing that's not going the way it normally does. So that's how you would tell, and that's, you know, what happened in Warren and Roseville.
So is that part of the training that happens at the county level for the local clerks and then the election workers? Is that part of the training that I go back to 2016 and, you know, people coming up and saying those questions and and someone asked me, what about the fraud? And I said, there's no fraud. It's human error because we are all humans and we run an election system has machines, but there are processes and it's about training. So is that part of it, that what you're talking about? Is that through the training that happens from the Bureau to?
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple of different layers of training. So we have general training that we provide for absentee ballot counting. We also have general training, which is to train the trainer that we provide about how election inspectors or poll workers are supposed to be trained. The actual training of the poll workers is done by county clerks, or in large cities and townships, it's done usually by the municipal clerk. And they determine some of the details of how those processes are going to work, like the more complex processes like overvotes and ballot duplication, how that works. And then there's also the operation of the voting equipment itself. And that's something that we don't provide training on that because there's specialized equipment. And so they get instructions, instruction user manuals from the vendors of those equipment. So there's a few different layers that all come together to provide the set of procedures that are used.
Kind of leads into my second question, my next question, which is, there wasn't any system issues in this election, correct? Either in ESS or Hart Verity or in Dominion? That was
No, I mean, well, there were no issues with how the tabulators worked. I mean, when we had issues, there were like human errors in either the settings or, I had gone through some of the unofficial results issues we had. We did have one issue when it came to the voter assist terminals that are used by some voters with disabilities. So there was a issue with how the Dominion ballot marking devices worked for people who wanted to vote straight party, to use that device to mark their ballot and vote straight party, and then wanted to vote for one party voter candidate of a different race. They were able to do that, but it was more inconvenient because of the way that the ballot marking device was set up. So for the voters who wanted to use that device to mark their ballots, which are then put in the tabulator, that was an issue that we had to provide some training to navigate. It didn't stop anyone from voting, but that's an issue that needs to be corrected.
That just brings me to a general question is, do we have any data on how many voters in the state utilize those machines with voter assistance I'm just curious if we do have any data on that.
I don't believe we do. I think you'd have to go through each precinct and identify the ballots that are printed out from those devices and count them up. I don't think we have any aggregate data on that.
And then did we have, sorry, I'm always full of questions. Was there any issues, I mean, other than the ones that you have reached out for canvassing, any canvassing issues that beyond the ones that you put into your report for us?
So as I mentioned, there were the issues in Allegan, Calhoun, and Mackinac with some of the numbers we had to correct. There were also issues with like some procedures being done out of order with some of the canvassing boards. So we had like one of the issues we had in Mackinac County, for example, is they voted before they had completed all their paperwork, and that's why we had to correct an error there. We had a similar issue in Calhoun County where they had some changes they made after they voted, and they signed, and then they signed the paperwork after they had voted the following day or 2 days later. So those were the kinds of issues that we saw. And we'll be addressing those with the clerks and the canvassing boards to make sure they understand the procedure they're supposed to follow. Ultimately, we did have all the canvassing boards did their job and they certified. There was no refusal to certify or unwillingness to do their work, but we did have some issues where things weren't being done in the order and the deadlines that were supposed to be done that we'll have to correct.
One more question, if that's okay, or do you want to go with that one?
Oh, no, I still have a question about, it's a really basic question about responsibility between the county and the local municipality. So it's my understanding that the county programs the tabulators?
Yes.
And then what responsibility or authority did the municipalities have to affect the operation of the tabulators?
Yeah, I mean, it varies depending on the equipment and the municipality. And some of these things are highly technical, and I'll answer them to the best of my knowledge, but you probably would need someone from the voting system vendors to really go into this level of detail. But I mean, the basic programming of the equipment is on a removable drive that is put into the tabulator. So the county is using their election management system software at the county level, and that's programming the election, and that's basically the brains of the election, and it's telling the system, okay, if the ballot is marked here, this is who that candidate is, and this is how those votes get counted. And so that gets put on a removable drive, which then gets put into the tabulator, which is basically just a scanner. And then that's interpreting the scans that are put in and connecting them to candidates and vote totals. And then that's all tested as well. So we have pre-election preliminary testing and public logic and accuracy testing that the municipal clerks typically do, which is done with test ballots to make sure that the tabulators are counting the ballots the way they're supposed to, and that the programming is working as it's expected. But then there's also, I mean, these are electronic devices, so there are settings on those machines. So there are settings that have to do with like how sensitive, the scanner is when it's picking up, like when it has enough of the oval darkened to consider that to be a marking on there. These are sort of like hardware or firmware settings on the device itself. So that's not part of the programming that goes in, which is about how it counts the ballots. So those are typically done by the municipal clerk user. And my understanding is, for example, the issue in Macomb County, that was a setting on the device itself in terms of, whether you segregate those ballots out for review or whether you just count the votes.
So you said that the issues were with the setting of the tabulator. And the question that I have is, I know that in Warren, the issue was flagged by a challenger. But is there a report that comes out that indicates the number of duplicated ballots, or some other report which is generated which would flag the issue either at the time that at the end of the day or for the canvassers?
So I don't know exactly how the first person who noticed the issue in Warren, I mean, I'm not sure whether that was an election worker or a challenger, but it was identified. In terms of the equipment itself, I mean, I think it depends on the specific equipment in terms of what reports you can run. But you can typically run, there's activity logs and things that are available that can be run to determine what happened on each of those tabulators in terms of user access. In terms of the number of ballots that were overvotes or things like that, I think it probably would depend on, that might depend on the programming, it might depend on the settings of the device. And I don't know exactly all of the reports you could get, but in general, there are pretty detailed audit logs available on that equipment.
Apart from the logs on the equipment, the reports that get generated with the number of ballots cast, et cetera, does that indicate the number? Would that indicate the number of duplicated ballots?
I don't believe so, because to a tabulator, the duplicated ballot looks just like a regular ballot. It's just been put on a different ballot. There might be other reports that you might be able to generate in terms of the number of ballots that were initially rejected as overvotes that you could use to figure that out. Also, for every report, you do have a total number of ballots cast, and then you have number of ballots cast in each race. So you can see if there's races where people didn't vote as many times. I mean, sometimes that just happens because voters chose not to vote in those races, but you would also be able to tell, if there were races where people hadn't recorded as many votes. So you could determine some of these things by looking at the results, but it would really just depend on the specific equipment.
So you used a term, and we talked before this meeting, you used a term that I never heard before. And I mentioned it to Vice Chair Hauskamp because he's my tech advisor here. And the term is firmware. Can you tell me what that is?
I can try. I think Member Hauskamp probably could explain that better than I can. I mean, but it's essentially, it's not hardware and it's not software. It's sort of interstitial electronic components of the equipment. But I believe Mr. Hauskamp could probably explain it better than I can.
The firmware that Mr. Brader is referring to is kind of a layer of software that lives right on the chipset of the machine. And it's not designed to be written to easily. It can be updated, but it's what you're updating it with flash memory. Is that you're updating it by a special process? It's software, but it's software that's designed to be right on the hardware, controls the hardware.
Semi-soft
Is that-
hardware.
No, that's real software. It's just not
Uh,
application software.
Right, yes. So what I'm seeking assurance on is that when mistakes are made, that we know that those mistakes are made and are able to correct them, either at the jurisdictional level or at the canvas.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways that we identify and correct mistakes. So, I mean, the canvas, part of the canvassing board's job is to identify tabulation errors and correct them. And that's what happened here. There's also the possibility of a recount. So, even if the canvassing board, if someone thinks that the ballots weren't properly tabulated, whether it be because of overvotes or anything else, people can always request a recount. And one of the things we do sometimes see in recounts is some of the numbers change a little bit. And the main reason, or one of the main reasons for that, is because of issues like overvotes, where when human beings look at it, they determine actually this vote should have been counted. So in addition to the built-in process that relies on the elected and appointed officials to review the materials and make sure the official results are correct, there's also an independent option that candidates have to request recounts. And then in terms of just identifying other errors that happen that aren't really about the outcome of the election, but just things that need to be corrected, that's why we have post-election audits. So we have audits that we do in hundreds of precincts, county clerks do them, and the Bureau of Elections does them. And we identify, we have a checklist of things that we go through. And when we identify those issues, again, this is not about the outcome of the election at this point, but it's about identifying those issues and correcting them in the future. So this will be, something that will definitely be a training point going forward.
Madam Chair, I just have one final question, and it kind of ties up everything. Once we certify, can you go over like the post certification process? And would that include, do you feel that we're going to be looking at system upgrades for our 3 voting systems in the state?
Yes, I can do that.
What's the post process first? We'll do the system, yeah, just how that all. Or are you doing that after?
Oh, did you want me to talk about it now? You said after we
I think
certify.
that was the question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's the question, just so.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, we will have, we always have updates to voting systems. So, throughout the year and throughout the election cycle, we do, smaller changes like a de minimis change where we might they're using a new printer that we need to approve. And then there's also changes, there are sort of updates to versions, improvements that are made to the currently used versions of each of our 3 vendors that we bring before the board. And then sometimes we also have new versions of the software that's used for the 3 vendors that we approve. And so all those things I would anticipate in the upcoming election cycle will have coming before the board. And we'll talk about, some of the things that are being improved and corrected during all those processes. And then also in a couple of years, the statewide voting system contract is up. We had a 10-year contract that started in, I think, in 2017. So for 2027, there's going to be a new contract period. So that will be an extended process where we'll be getting input from the clerks, certainly, and we'll have a sort of a public process where we develop the requirements for the contract, and there'll be a bidding process, and obviously the board will be involved in that as well.
Are you, I guess the question I don't know if I can ask you this at this time, but I mean, are we looking at, I think I'm the only board member that was actually here at the last time that we went through a voting system, change in the state. Are you saying that you're looking at the contract, or are you saying that there could be we go through the whole process that we did in 17?
I think it'll be similar to the process. I mean, I wasn't here, but I think it'll be similar to the process in 2017 because it was a 10-year contract,
Yeah.
which is expired. So we need to reevaluate the whole thing. I don't know what the next contract will look like. We're way too early in the process to determine the details of that, but it will be similar to what we did in 10 years ago.
I just have one question. Director Brader, can you just for clarification sake, I'm not necessarily asking. If somebody looks at the total voters by county and it's 5,706,503. And then they go and they look at the total votes cast for the office of president. So not just Trump and Harris, but all of the other non-party affiliation or minor party. And that's the difference between total voters and number in the presidential is just over 42,000. Why is that?
I think, well, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one might be people overvoted. Like that's one issue where their votes didn't count because they voted for more than one candidate. You could also have people who did write-ins that were invalid. So if you make a write-in vote for somebody who's not a valid write-in candidate, like if you write in Mickey Mouse, for example, that doesn't get counted. So that would be, a ballot cast, but not a ballot cast for president. And then some people just choose not to vote in certain races. Those who have gone around campaigning, I'm sure, are familiar with all voters' unique opinions about all the candidates and who they do and do not want to vote for. So in some cases, we just have people who want to vote in some races, but not others. So that's a ballot cast, but it wouldn't have a vote cast in that particular race.
Thank you.
I have a question about absentee votes. So I understand that when a person receives an absentee ballot, they can tabulate it at the early voting center, which I did myself. It was a great opportunity. That then counts not as an absentee vote, but an early vote.
That's correct.
So when you say 2.2 million voters voted by absent voter ballot, those would be the ones that are counted either in the precincts or in the absent voter counting boards?
Right. So if somebody requested an absentee ballot and then they decided to vote it during early voting, it basically gets converted to an early voting ballot and counts as an early voting ballot.
And if they tabulate it on election day, it counts as an election day ballot?
That's right.
Okay.
That brings up a question I have, if that's okay, Madam Chair. In the event of a recount, we have now 3 buckets, right? AVs would be a separate request. In-person early voting would be a request, and then election day results would be a request.
That's right. Yeah.
So if someone wanted the recount, that they would have to request each of those sections of voters.
Right.
Any other questions? Mr. Neenstadt also requested to speak on this issue.
Frederick Neenstead, Macomb County. I would like to commend the canvassing board in Macomb County for the exemplary work that they did tabulating and retabulating votes according to the needs. There was a suspicion of trouble that was reported early, and the fact that the canvassing board did their work appropriately, everything came out proper, right? Everything was good. There's all an acceptable agreement that every vote was properly counted. But it raises a concern. How can a machine not be properly set up? And is there an oversight that would be required at the municipal level. So I don't know that you can answer that, but I would expect in your post-election analysis that that would be a significant part of it. But there's also another question that was not really addressed in your commentary or the questions. And early voting put quite a load of work on the canvassing board. Thousands of people voted over multiple days. And it's a little bit of a question for me as to how to interpret a single tabulator at an early voting site. Is it a precinct? Does the tape have the need to be continuous? Is there a method that municipal clerks need to understand about how to suspend and restart these machines properly? And is there an oversight that there is no change in the vote somehow, right? From day, so we go to home and we come back next morning and the machine is exactly as we left it. And we know that because it's in the tape. Director Brader mentioned that there's I think he called it an auto log, or there's a report that comes out that's available in case you do diagnostics on the machine that would pretty much define anything that happened while the machine was in use over the early voting period. So again, my concern is the amount of work that the canvassing board had to do. I witnessed it. It put a lot of burden on their staff. They had to call in quite a few extra people from municipal resources to complete the job correctly. So again, this might be your post-analysis, but I want to know, is there a report that describes the correct way to recount a tabulator? Is it a precinct? Is the early voting site a precinct? If there's an out of balance condition, does it invalidate multiple precincts? So if you could comment on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Let me answer quickly, and then Director Brader can answer with more specificity. But I know that after the citizens passed the Promote the Vote ballot initiative in 2022, calling for at least 9 days of early voting, the election law was extensively amended in order to implement those provisions. And so there are extensive provisions in the election law with regard to how early voting is conducted. I know that each early voting site is a separate precinct, and that they do, close every day, but they don't, the tabulator keeps running. So Director Brader can explain that more fully, although it sounds like you understand it pretty well.
Well, there's an additional follow-up question I'd like to make when he's ready, but so the overview, I want to make sure I have the overview correct, right? Is my perception reasonably accurate?
So when it comes to the recounting of the early voting sites, each precinct is treated as a precinct within the early voting site. So an early voting site will have, if it's a more than one precinct jurisdiction, or if it's a countywide site, you're going to have, potentially dozens or even hundreds of precincts at an early voting site. But when you're recounting at the precinct level.
So is the early voting tabulator a precinct, or is it multiple precincts?
Well, for purposes of the recount, it's treated as multiple precincts. I mean, practically speaking, it is a tabulator that has been programmed to accept and tabulate ballots for multiple precincts, if that's the way the early voting site is set up. But for purposes of a recount, each precinct within that early voting site is recounted individually.
And is there an exception for out of balance conditions on these tabulators at early voting sites?
So the out of balance process is the same. So if a precinct can be recounted if it's out of balance in certain circumstances. So if there's an explanation for the precinct being out of balance, it can be recounted. If the precinct is out of balance in the sense that, because the number of ballots tabulated report does not equal the number of names on the poll book or the voter list, the precinct can still be recounted if the number of physical ballots in the tabulator matches the number of ballots on the tabulator tape or the voter list. So that precinct would be out of balance, but it would still be recountable. And so that those same procedures would apply to early voting.
So you would rule out the possibility that a municipality that accepts all precincts at a single tabulator at an early voting site would never be precluded from recount?
Yeah, early voting sites can be recounted. Yeah.
Okay. So one last question. In the analysis of your follow-up, do you have any sort of hash report on the retabulating hardware? There's a firmware question that was brought up. Do you include that information? Is it publicly available?
So the equipment is owned not by the state, but by the municipalities, in some cases the county. So that would be a question of what, how that specific equipment works and what information is retained and can be shared publicly by the municipalities and the counties. There's certain information that, for security reasons is not disclosed, but the information that would be available would be in the possession of clerks, not the state.
Municipal clerks would have this information? And that's after 30 days after state certification, would that be correct?
But again, it depends on the specific equipment we're talking about, the jurisdiction. I mean, I cannot give a global answer to that kind of question.
Right, there's too many variations with the early voting contracts. I invite Mr. Hauskamp to add anything that might be.
I'm sorry, I
appropriate.
can't hear you.
I'm hoping that Mr. Hauskamp could maybe add a little bit because of his knowledge.
Mr. Housecamp's going to just listen this time.
Okay, all right, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have one other question. You mentioned, of course, the very decentralized election administration system that Michigan has. And I did see a report some time ago that the Bureau had removed election responsibility from a township clerk. I think it was Rock River or River Rock. It was a place I had never heard of, but can you describe how that happened and what the Bureau does with regard to clerks who have indicated that they don't intend to follow the election law?
Sure, yeah. So it was Rock River Township in Alger County in the Upper Peninsula. This does not happen very often, but there are times when if a municipal clerk indicates that they are not going to follow the election law, the typical practice is I will send them a letter or a communication explaining what the statutory requirement is and asking them to confirm that they will follow the statutory requirement. In this case, the township clerk indicated that he was not planning to follow the requirement. He had indicated that rather than following tabulation on election night, rather than immediately putting the ballots into sealed containers as required, he was going to conduct a separate hand count of the ballots. And so he indicated that he was intending to do that despite being told that it was not permitted under the election law. So at that point, I instructed him to refrain from administering elections in the township under the supervisory authority that the Secretary of State has and that I can exercise. And then there were different township officials who were entrusted with running the election because of that. So to be clear, I cannot remove someone from office, but I can instruct them not to conduct election administration activities in certain circumstances.
Any questions for Director Brader on that issue? Thank you. Any further questions? I believe it is time for motions.
Maybe before we do that, just a note of thanks publicly to the team at Bureau of Elections and to all the folks downstate for a fabulous election, well-run election.
We don't have a motion prepared for us by the Bureau, but I would entertain a motion to commend the Bureau and the election administrators around the state who as Director Brader noted, did a wonderful job on this election, which was a very challenging election. Do we have a motion?
You want me to do that?
Absolutely.
I move that the Board of State Canvassers offers our profound thank you and congratulations to the Bureau of Elections staff that provides us with the information and election administrators throughout the state of all parties for the work that they have done. It makes our job easier when everybody does what they are supposed to and follows the law.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
And she's going to kill me, but a special shout out to Leslie Daunt, Township Clerk in Woodhall Township, for the work she did. It's my aunt.
We want a motion? Okay. So we have a number of motions which need to be considered with regard to the certification of the election.
Well, I'm rolling, so I guess I'll keep going. Based on, let me restart. I move that based on an examination of the election returns received by the Secretary of State for the November 5, 2024 general election, we, the Board of State Canvassers, certify that the attached reports are true statements of the votes cast at the election for the offices certified by this board and for the electors of President and Vice President of the United States. We further certify that the persons named on the attached listing were duly elected for the indicated offices.
Support.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries.
I'll make the next motion. I move that the,
I'm sorry, can I interrupt real quick?
we have to notify the time.
Yeah, just for the record, it's 11:21 a.m. Thank you.
I'll make a motion that I move that the Board of State Canvassers authorize the staff of the Bureau of Elections to represent the board in any recount votes cast at the November 5th, 2024 general election.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
The motion carries. I believe the next item on our agenda is anything else. And we do have also, you have furnished us with the letter which was sent to the Cornell West campaign pursuant to the directive to the Board of State Canvassers from the Michigan Court of Appeals. And could you tell us, Director Brader, or perhaps, okay, I don't know if this is for the director or for our attorney, how that letter was responded to.
Well, the correspondence has really been through the attorneys, so I think probably AG's office.
Right, so after our last meeting, or at our last meeting, right, we discussed sending correspondence to Cornell West campaign with respect to our obligation to investigate the petition signatures of the circular signatures on petitions. And so we did craft, with the assistance of Adam and Director Brader, a letter was crafted to Mr. West that was then communicated to Mr. Debus, who appeared as counsel for Dr. West at the relevant meetings. And so that letter, which I sent to you all this morning and also provided you copies with today, was sent on October 21st. And it asked for the West campaign to provide, whatever kind of documentation they could to sort of support the identities of these petition circulators that were identified in the challenges that were filed previously. His deadline to respond to our letter was November 15th, so they were a little bit late after that. I prompted them earlier this week, and then we received the attached correspondence, I think after 5 last night, I provided you copies with that. I've also forwarded it to you in your emails. I actually have not looked at it thoroughly yet since it did come in last night. But they did responded to our letter, and it looks like they provided copies of driver's licenses or other, proof of identity for at least some of the circulators. So I think, my thought today would be, we have another meeting on December 2nd. So if you want to peruse what we received from the West campaign through their council, and think about what more does this satisfy your concerns? Do we have enough? Do we need to do more? And we can talk about what other steps should be taken or need to be taken at our next meeting. So that was my thought.
Right, so today is November 22nd, and I see that the response to the letter you sent was dated November 21st. So I understand that there hasn't been any effort to review it, but I think suggesting that we consider this at our December 2nd meeting is really in order. One other matter, and that is that we were included in our packet are some emails, one of which commends the state's election workers, as we have ourselves done. One of them seems to be asking the State Board of Canvassers to take some action with regard to a matter in Montmorency County. And I think that I'm not sure, excuse me, I'm not sure if we're called upon necessarily to address this, but you have included it as and it is a communication to the state board.
Dated November 8th.
Right, and it is asking us, I believe, to do something which we have no authority to do. Can you address that? Heather?
Yes, I can. If you're we're referring about the letter that was in your public comment packet from, it looks like.
It's a letter dated November 8th, and it is from Judith A. Rapun.
Right. As I understand the correspondence, it looks like there was a candidate in Montmorency County who managed to run for both school board and either county or township treasurer at the same time. Typically, you can't run for incompatible offices or even two offices. Ed might be able to clarify that. So, but for whatever reasons, this person's candidacy was allowed to go forward for both races. So she did appear on the ballot for both races, and it does appear that she was successful in both races. So at this point, the role of the Board of Canvassers, and actually what we've already done, is to simply look at Montmorency County numbers, and all your duty is ministerial, and we're just certifying that the numbers for Montmorency County are correct. So there really isn't any authority for this board to not certify a particular race or something like that for the county. So there really isn't anything that this board can do with respect to what looks like something that probably shouldn't have happened, but it sounds like there's also litigation pending in Montmorency County. So at this point, it would be something for the courts to resolve. It typically, when people are elected, so post-election, the remedy is a quo warranto action or something of that nature. If somebody's been elected to an office that they were not eligible to run for. And so that's a private action that people can bring to displace a person from an elected office. So that's where the remedy would seem to lie, or that's something that can be brought up in the existing litigation.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have anything further from any members? Director Brighter, anything further?
Nothing for me.
I believe that concludes our agenda. We have a motion to adjourn, or should we just,
Move to adjourn.
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And people need to understand that the Board of Canvassers has an obligation to sign the certification of oaths for every person who has been elected. So we have to sign, each of us have to sign hundreds of documents. That is our next task.
Change my name to X.
Did not.